Today's occurrence happens 100 feet below the ocean's surface. A man working on a boat found himself trapped with cold, pitch-black water rushing around him. He was completely alone. He could only assume the rest of his crew was dead. And he would be the same too, once where he was completely filled with water. Alone and scared, you can feel your oxygen running out with every breath you take. It's a nightmare I don't even like to think about, but for him, this was his reality. A reality he survived for more than 60 hours. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the incredible story of Harrison Okene. Harrison Okene was a 29-year-old cook on the Sunken, a tugboat working 20 miles off the coast of Nigeria. They're small but very powerful boats that move larger sea vessels, like anything from huge ships to oil platforms. You can think of them as tow trucks for sea vessels. And the Sunken wasn't the only tugboat trying to stabilize the tanker. There were 2 more tugboats attached to keep it upright. So bright and early, around 5 a.m. on May 26, 2013, Harrison woke up. He was on the vessel he worked as a cook and had been with this particular company for the past 3 years. It was stormy when he woke up, so between the rain, waves, and ocean swells, he had to support himself against the wall while the tugboat rocked. He was only wearing his boxers since he hadn't gotten dressed yet. He got up to say his prayers like he did every morning, and then went to the galley to turn on the hot plates for breakfast. After that, Harrison went to the bathroom to start his day. There were 4 other crew members brushing their teeth at the sink. That's a little crowded, and Harrison had to use it, so he figured he would just wait and went to the toilets. Now, while he was sleeping and then waking up and going about his business, the tugboat was manned by other people, because, again, Harrison is just the cook. His focus is on if the crew enjoys his meals, that no one is getting sick from food poisoning or anything like that. And at this particular moment, that he's supposed to go on leave in 3 days. But the boat was in the process of stabilizing a several 100-foot long oil tanker, completely filled to the brim with gasoline that it just extracted from a nearby oil platform. Considering this is part of what was globally at the time a almost 1.3 trillion with a T dollar oil and gas industry, that today is now $4 or $5 trillion worth in revenue, that also extracts an insane amount of oil from deep within the ocean every year, it would not only be horrible for the environment for this tanker to spill, it would be an incredibly costly thing to happen. So the crew on Harrison's boat were called to fix a line on the tanker to keep it from capsizing. But while Harrison was sitting down, he looks out the window and has a passing thought that the boat might flip over. Now, he's been doing this for a few years at this point, so he doesn't think much of it. He knows the risks of his job, but it seems like it would be impossible for that to happen with the way ships are designed and with the current conditions. And as soon as he disregarded that idea, a huge wave hit the Sunken and flipped it upside down. So now Harrison is on the floor / technically ceiling, and the toilet is above him. He got up to try and open the door to leave when the toilet fell and hit him on the head. Immediately, there's blood pouring from where he was just hit, and almost as immediately, the lights shut off. It was dark in the bathroom, and it quickly started filling up with water. Panicking, he tried to open the door again, and eventually managed to go into the passageway. He couldn't tell which way he was facing, but he saw the light to someone's phone, so he followed it to the exit hatch, which was a watertight door. When he got there, 3 other crew members were already struggling to open the hatch. He helped them try to get it open, but Harrison didn't have the patience to wait for them to get that door open, and he was worried about water pushing into the boat and submerging them in that same spot. So he turned away from the exit and swam back into the passageway. And even though I'm sure that goes against every instinct that someone would have, he did it. While he was swimming away and trying to catch his breath, a strong wave of water swept and pushed the guys by the exit away. The force was so strong, Harrison knew they were dead. Then that same water swept him into a bathroom, and this bathroom was connected to the second engineer's cabin. When he was swept in, the door shut behind him, and the water kept rising. Now, because of the threat of pirates, the crew would regularly keep all the cabin doors shut. And because of that, the air couldn't leave the boat completely. Some of it stayed trapped inside. The bathroom he got swept into was one of them, so the bathroom didn't fill up completely. Harrison kept his head in the small air pocket below the ceiling / technically floor, holding onto the sink until the boat sank 100 feet or 30 meters down and landed on the ocean floor. At that point, all he could hear was everyone shouting and calling and crying, and he felt like his best chance was to try the exit hatch again. So he tried to leave the bathroom, but in his panic, he broke off the handle to the door. Now, when this happened, he realized he needed to stop panicking, calm down, gather his composure, and think of a way out. Harrison has always been a practical thinker. Being one of the youngest of 12 other siblings, 9 boys and 4 girls, so he just told himself that he was in charge of the situation and took a moment to think it through. Once he spotted a vent, he broke off a piece of it and used it to pry open the door attached to the second engineer's cabin. While he was trying to get the door open, one by one, the shouts from the other crew members fell silent. Assuming they escaped, Harrison finally got the door open and searched the cabin for things he could use. He found 2 life jackets with 2 lights. He took the lights, putting one in his mouth and the other in his boxers. Then he swam back to the exit door again to try and escape. But out in the passageway, there were no air pockets. It was completely filled with water. So Harrison had to swim back from the exit door to the air pocket in the bathroom to catch his breath. The first time he did that, he almost missed the second engineer's room because there were so many doors. Between the mess room, the engine room, other cabins, if you got stuck in another room, you'd be toast. If you don't act quickly enough, you'll die. So when he made it into the cabin, he looked through the bags and found things he would need, including overalls. Those are a one-piece, loose-fitting garment that covers the entire body, from your neck down to your ankles. Harrison tore the coveralls into strips and tied the strips together into a rope. Then he tied one end of it to the door of the cabin. So now, if he got lost or too tired after trying to open the hatch, he could pull himself back using the rope. He tried opening the exit over and over again for several hours. And here's the thing. Harrison wasn't supposed to be on this specific ship on that day. Yeah, he was there, but first of all, how he got this job at this company was because growing up, he learned to cook from his mom because he loves food. He also used to carry the vegetables for her to sell at their local market. His dad wanted him to learn catering as a life skill, so Harrison and his mom learned how to do that at a hotel. Then he went to college, but after college, he didn't have a job. So he fell back on his cooking and catering skills that he learned from his mom and the hotel. When he was cooking on land, it was okay. He would be cooking for several thousand people and had more help, but it didn't pay much. But his uncle worked as a manager in a marine company. Harrison knew that the cooks on sea vessels only had to cook for their crew of about 12 people, and the pay was way better. He met with his uncle at his office, knowing that he would need certifications and things to have a job like that. But his uncle didn't want him working at his company at all and sent him away. Well, Harrison wanted that job, so before he left, he went up to one of the security guards at his uncle's building and asked them if he could submit his CV. The guy agreed to take it, so Harrison wrote one out for himself. And before he submitted it, he said, quote, "God in my shame, you will bring me double. I pray the CV will bring me back to the same place." End quote. And then he left. A couple weeks later, while his uncle was on leave, Harrison started working at that company. By the time his uncle made it back, the captain of the vessel Harrison was working on gave Harrison such high remarks that not only did it surprise his uncle, but he couldn't justify firing him. The guy said Harrison was one of the best cooks he's had, and it sounds like ultimately his uncle was impressed that Harrison was able to get the job without his help. But it wasn't just that, because Harrison was working on another boat. It was docked, but he was supposed to be on there for 2 weeks. Well, he did the first week, and then he wanted to take some time off for the second week. But the person who was supposed to replace him said they weren't feeling well and couldn't come. So Harrison was asked to stay for another week, which he agreed to do, and was 3 days away from being able to go on leave when this happened. Now, after about 10 trips back and forth, Harrison needed a moment to catch his breath. He was cold and tired. If he stood up, the water would be above his head. So he pulled down wooden panels from the ceiling and tied them together into a little raft. With that, he could kind of lean and not fully sit in the air pocket with his lower body completely in the water. He could feel the crawfish nibbling at him while he figured out what to do next. He could hear the sounds of vessels in the ocean above him, and not much else. That's when he knew he shouldn't leave his spot. So Harrison started praying because he had nothing else to do at that moment, and he's always been very religious. His prayers consisted of how he got the job through God's favor and not through himself. So it should bring him peace and not kill him. And then Harrison continued to pray and told himself that he would not die like this. It wasn't his time. Previously, Harrison had a dream, or should I say nightmare, of dying in a capsized ship. At the time, he blew it off. But now he thought about his mother, his wife, and how they would be feeling and treated if he died. Harrison started getting tired, going back and forth from praying and singing church songs. He would splash water on his chest to keep himself awake, and snacked on sardines and sipped Coke that he found in a bag near him. He had to consume both sparingly because he already swallowed so much salt water before that he was dehydrated. His throat throbbed and his tongue peeled. If he wanted the life jacket to help him stay above water easier, he couldn't use it. At that point, it was soaked with diesel and completely compressed, so it wouldn't work. His lights eventually went out, and he was in complete darkness. He couldn't see a single thing, but he could hear everything in the ocean and everything around him. He tried to get rid of his fear, because fear in that situation can kill you fast. Panicking would make him blow through the air supply in his air pocket faster than it should. After what felt like a day to Harrison, he heard the sound of something falling into the water. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was a different sound, and it sounded like it might be from outside of the boat. So Harrison started banging on the walls to signal. If it was a person outside, great. Another survivor, not the worst thing ever. But nothing happened. An unknown amount of time, hours or days passed before he thought he saw a reflection of light. He swam into the water to try and find it, but he couldn't, so he swam back to his makeshift raft. After more time passed, he saw the water bubbling out of the reflection of light. He took another deep breath, fully aware that his air was running out, but he tried again. This time he saw a diver swimming with a long umbilical cable, but he was swimming away. The umbilical is a set of pipes and cables that feeds gas to the divers and allows for communication and video recording between other divers and the ship. So Harrison quickly tries to swim behind him and catch up. He taps on the back of the diver's helmet, and the diver turns to see Harrison's palm floating in the water. So the diver tells base that he found another body. And I've said in other episodes, divers should have multiple lights, and they should be bright enough for them to see. But seeing underwater in the dark is still not clear. Being in a ship, there isn't really silt, but it's still murky and foggy. And even though it's not a cave, it's not open, so it's still a maze. Now, even though Harrison doesn't know that the diver just reported him as a dead body, he can tell the diver didn't register that he was alive. So he reached out and moved his fingers around and squeezed the diver's hand to show that he was alive. But Harrison doesn't have an air tank, so he starts trying to pull the diver a little bit so he can understand that he needs to go back to where he came from. The diver follows him back to his air pocket, and the diver has to signal to Harrison because he has a mask on and Harrison can't understand what he's saying while he's wearing it. So the diver starts signaling, asking if Harrison is the only one, and if he's sure that he's the only one, and Harrison tells him yes. So the diver asked him to wait while he swims away. He comes back with a bottle of water for Harrison to drink, and while Harrison was thirsty, he didn't drink much, because his focus was on when he was getting out of the ship. The only thing on his mind was leaving, but the diver kept telling him to drink the water because he wasn't going anywhere until he finished it. Harrison finished the water, and the oxygen started really thinning out, so he started splashing more water on his chest and taking short open-mouthed breaths to keep air in his lungs, and to keep him from panicking. The diver tells him to stay there because he will be back, and Harrison watches him go. Now, even though the diver was leaving, Harrison was so happy. He had no idea how the diver managed to get into the ship, but he was just happy that he did. The diver came back with a bright yellow reflective strapped vest for Harrison to put on. He had to help Harrison put it on because his legs were swollen, his stomach was bloated, and his body was bruised from the crawfish tearing at him, and he just couldn't stand on his own after being in the water for so long. The diver left and came back with the helmet. When he put it on, Harrison could feel cool air blowing in his face, and he could hear someone named Kobe talking to him. Kobe asked Harrison if he could hear him and if he was okay. And after Harrison confirmed both of those things, he told him the name of his diver was Nico Funhaden, and he explained to him how he was going to follow Nico out. Nico told him that he had to swim behind him on the green rope. Now, Harrison felt too weak to swim, so he just fell forwards into the water and let himself float. They tried talking to him and asking if he was okay, but Harrison didn't respond. He kept quiet. So they thought he passed out and had Nico pull him out of the ship. Now, when Harrison was free from the ship, he couldn't go to the surface. He was taken to a diving bell. When they were in the diving bell, Nico told Harrison that he scared him and asked if he was okay. Harrison understood that yes, he did scare him, but he needed Nico to understand he wasn't going to be able to pull himself out of the ship, and he needed him to do it for him. So because he scared the guy, he didn't tell Nico that he kind of faked passing out. He just responded saying he was fine now. Now what Harrison didn't know until he was in the dive bell was that he wasn't just in there for a day, like he thought. He had been trapped in the air bubble in the ship for 3 days, over 60 hours, and he was the only survivor. It turns out none of the other crew was ever actually able to get the exit hatch open, and some of them died in the passageway leading up to the hatch. Harrison could kind of tell some of them were in the passageway because when he swam by them trying to escape, he could feel their swollen remains. And while he sat in the dark for 3 days, he could hear sea life feeding on them. But he believed when he heard the shouts dying down, one after the other, while the ship sank, it was because some of them were leaving. But it turns out no one did, and one of the men was never found. Harrison also learned what happened after the boat flipped. Because the hull of the boat broke when the wave hit it, the boat sank rapidly to the seabed. It actually sank so fast that the captain didn't get a chance to send a distress signal to Channel 16, which is the international distress frequency for ocean vessels. Another one of the tugboats supporting the tanker radioed it in. When a helicopter made it to the location, the boat was submerged and the search for survivors continued until the end of the day. The Jaskin 4 landed on the masthead, which is the highest point of the ship and is used for navigation, lights, radar, and communication equipment. Normally, the mast extends high above the ship's deck, but once it capsized and sunk, it pinned the boat to the seabed. Now, when no one was found, the search was called off, and the call went out for recovery. 65 nautical miles away from the Jaskin 4, a crew of 6 divers was working to lay oil pipes 230 feet, or about 70 meters deep. Their vessel was being operated by the same company as Harrison's. The company contacted Kobe, the dive supervisor, and manning the vessel the divers were connected to. They asked Kobe if the divers would recover the remains of the 12 men presumed dead. It wasn't in their job description to do the recovery, but being divers, especially saturation divers, they knew it could have been them, and if one day it was, they would need divers to come retrieve them. So they agreed, but like Harrison, they couldn't just ascend to the surface and go to where he was located. The divers had to decompress, and the vessel they were attached to had to travel to the Jaskin 4. Luckily, they could do both at the same time. Nautical miles are longer than normal miles, and they're used to measure distance at sea, in the air, or in space. So 65 nautical miles is equivalent to about 75 land miles, or 121 kilometers. On land, that would take you an hour to travel, if you're on a nice, traffic-free highway. In the ocean, it takes longer, and the diver's vessel is in the same storm as Harrison's boat, so the travel time to get there was about 17 hours. By the time they made it to where the Jaskin 4 sank, the storm passed and the divers were done decompressing. They went about locating the ship. It wasn't in the same spot since the current moved it from its original location. Once they found it, 3 divers were sent in the dive bell down to where the Jaskin 4 was. 2 divers left the bell and swam to the ship, and 1 stayed in the bell to provide support. The diver that stayed in the bell was named Andrea Rasmus. Like I mentioned earlier, there are pirates in the area where the boat was working, so the doors were closed. But they weren't just closed, They were locked, so the divers had to use their engineering and welding tools that they usually use on the job to break into the ship. Only one diver goes inside. The other feeds the umbilical cable to the diver going inside. The diver feeding the umbilical is Daryl Ersthazen. Everyone involved has to carefully navigate the dangerous ship conditions. The ship being on the masthead makes it unstable and potentially fatal if it shifts or falls over. Then there's the fact that the ship is upside down, and it's not like the divers inside are even familiar with it right side up. Add in the poor visibility, objects that got tossed around when it flipped, and the remains of the people you're trying to recover. It's not a forgiving environment. Now, some reports say Harrison banged on the wall after hearing divers banging outside to check for survivors, or that they were putting a marker buoy on the vessel to warn other traffic where the wreck was located. If that did happen, the divers definitely didn't know he was banging on the wall or that anyone was even alive because of how shocked Nico was when Harrison grabbed his hand. And then when they realized he was alive, they scrambled to figure out what to do. He started running out of breathable air in his air pocket because every time he exhaled, he let out carbon dioxide. The effects of that increases the deeper you are. Now, the divers are breathing trimix, a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium. The helium is added because it's lighter than nitrogen and dilutes it without the narcotic effects, which counteracts nitrogen narcosis / decompression sickness / the bends. The symptoms vary anywhere from joint pain, dizziness, hallucination, paralysis, all the way to death in extreme cases. So when Harrison was waiting after being found, it was because the people on the surface were tracking down hyperbaric doctors that specialize in medicine under pressure. They had to know it was safe to give Harrison the same gas they were breathing. The divers had time to adjust to their gas mixture, but Harrison didn't. The doctors ultimately decided that it was safe to let Harrison breathe trimix because his body had been absorbing nitrogen at that depth the entire time. The helium would be replacing the nitrogen already in him. They just had to make sure the mixture was right. While they were waiting for Harrison's helmet to be ready, Nico released some of his gas into the air pocket to revive the air so Harrison could breathe while he drank the water. Nico just had to be careful not to release too much and destabilize the ship. Now, once Harrison made it to the dive bell, he was brought to the deck of a vessel and transferred into the decompression chamber. He would spend the next 3 days decompressing. He had to spend that long decompressing because when he was trapped for 60 plus hours at that depth, his body absorbed huge amounts of nitrogen from the air around him in the pressurized environment. The deeper you are underwater, the higher the pressure, and that increases the amount of nitrogen that dissolves into the body's tissues and bloodstream. The dive bell acts like an elevator and allows Harrison to ascend in a controlled environment, so the pressure could be properly equalized before he's moved into a decompression chamber to continue the same process in a more comfortable environment. While he was decompressing, they checked his vitals, memory, and things like that to see if he was okay. His blood pressure was normal, his temperature was normal, everything was normal, which is apparently not normal. They kind of expected something to be wrong, but he was completely fine, at least physically. Nico apparently helped nurse Harrison back to health by doing things like helping him take the medicine prescribed by the hyperbaric doctor, eat, and anything else he needed. Once he was out of the chamber, Harrison was urged to go to the hospital, but he refused. He was desperate to go home, and over the next 2 weeks, the media was at his front door during the day, and at night, he would have nightmares, feeling like the bed was sinking. He would pick up his wife and carry her while trying to run out the door. At some point, the company reached out to check in on Harrison, and when he told them what had been happening, they suggested he try and change his environment. So Harrison and his wife went to Gambia for a break, and the hotel he stayed at was on the seafront. Considering what just happened, that sounds like it'd be a terrible place to recover. But for Harrison, the ocean has always been a very peaceful place for him. So he swam in the pool, he swam in the ocean, and when he went back home, he was okay. The next year, in 2014, Harrison was working again, same company, but an office job now. While he was driving to work with a friend, on the way to work, his car went off a bridge. When he opened his eyes, the car was upside down, underwater, but Harrison managed to swim out. When he got out, he realized his friend was still in the passenger seat, so he had to swim back to get him. Neither one of them were injured, so they went to the police station. And that's where he was told that he had to go back and remove the car himself. So Harrison went back to where his car crashed and pulled the car out of the water himself using a rope. That seemed to be a turning moment for him, because after that, he could never answer the question of what he was really afraid of, and how could he be scared after everything he's been through. Like, after everything he saw, he felt like he shouldn't be afraid of anything, so naturally, he decided to train as a diver. Now, his older brother told him that was a terrible idea because after not one, but two scary instances involving water, and one of them being seemingly impossible, why test it? But the year after that, Harrison and his wife split. And Harrison at that point, alone, with no children, no wife, terrible job. He had a dog, but he was depressed and frustrated, and no one knew. It sounds like mentally he was in a very dangerous place. I mean, he had PTSD and he wasn't treating it. So he decided to do what he wanted to do, and that was to dive. He joined a 3-month diving course and didn't tell anyone until he completed it. He wanted to embrace his fear and be strong and face it head on. When he came to the class, the instructor was actually scared for him because having a phobia or panicking while diving is almost guaranteed to end less than ideal. So they paired him up with the beginner instructor and she put him in a water tank to see how he would react. He was completely calm and level, to everyone's surprise, so they let him continue with the course. Anytime they went out to the sea to train, there would be crowds or people taking pictures and videos of Harrison. Once he completed training, he finally came clean to his brother. A few years later, he went back for more training and is certified for commercial diving. He's able to go 164 feet or 50 meters deep. He's working as a saturation diver that installs structures and makes repairs to oil rigs and gas facilities. And he likes to bring awareness to the importance of safety training for offshore oil and gas workers. And yes, he's still at the same company. He remarried with 3 children, and he feels his experience underwater and his survival improved his life and his faith. He has a house by a lake, and he hopes to one day have a house by the ocean. Stay safe, and I'll be back next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.